For centuries, the inner chambers of Egypt's pharaohs have been portrayed as silent rooms of stone, sealed to protect the dead and the treasures meant to guide them into eternity. Yet these spaces were far more than tombs. They were the final theaters of royal identity, carefully designed to shape the journey of a ruler whose power extended beyond life itself. Every chamber carried meaning. Every corridor reflected a belief system that linked the earthly kingdom with the world of the gods. The construction of these interior rooms demanded extraordinary planning, unseen craftsmanship, and a secret knowledge that only a few were permitted to understand. Historians often focus on the grandeur of the pyramids or the splendor of the Valley of the Kings, but the true story lies deeper within, where rituals, symbols, and architecture came together to create an environment meant to transform a mortal ruler into a divine presence. Exploring these spaces allows us to uncover fragments of a world that has been hidden by stone, time, and the silence of those who built it. What happened inside these chambers reveals a civilization that treated death not as an ending, but as a sacred continuation of royal purpose. The entrance into a pharaoh's burial chamber was never intended as a mere doorway. It represented a boundary that separated the world of the living from the realm of the dead, and crossing it required rituals that were performed with absolute precision. These rituals began long before the king's body arrived at the burial site. Priests prepared themselves through purification ceremonies that included bathing in cold water, burning incense made from imported resins, and reciting ancient hymns that had been memorized over generations. Their role demanded purity of action and clarity of mind, because the king's transition to the afterlife depended on their ability to guide spiritual forces through this passage. The architectural design of the threshold reflected this importance. Builders carved the limestone or granite with careful intent, ensuring that the edges of the doorway aligned with religious orientations, connected to the stars or specific deities. Hieroglyphic inscriptions were placed around the entrance to invoke protection, calling upon gods like Anubis and Osiris to guard the king's spirit. These inscriptions were not decorative. They formed a protective layer of written power, believed to activate once the chamber was sealed. In some tombs, false doors were carved to serve as symbolic passages for the Ka, the spiritual double of the king, allowing it to move freely between realms without disturbing the physical seals that protected the tomb itself. When the procession carrying the king's body approached the threshold, the atmosphere changed. The musicians lowered their instruments. The wailing of mourners softened to a controlled chant. The priest stepped forward and removed the linens that covered the royal coffin. This moment marked the beginning of the ritual known as the opening of the mouth. Through a series of precise gestures and recitations, the lead priest touched the coffin with ceremonial tools carved from copper or shaped from rare stone. The purpose was to restore the king's senses so he could see, breathe, and speak again in the afterlife. The threshold acted as the boundary where this restoration took place, symbolizing the point where the dead king reclaimed the abilities of a living ruler. Inside the corridor, beyond the threshold, silence was a requirement rather than a custom. The priests believed that careless words or stray thoughts could attract harmful forces that moved between worlds. They carried lamps fueled by thick oils that burned slowly and cast long shadows on the painted walls. The flickering light illuminated scenes from the king's reign, images of deities offering protection, and instructions drawn from sacred funerary texts. These scenes guided the spirit of the king as he prepared to journey through the complex landscape of the afterlife. Nothing in the passage was accidental. Every symbol, every line of text, every figure had a role to play. Moving deeper into the structure, the priest paused at designated points. These pauses allowed them to recite additional prayers that activated protective spells embedded in the architecture itself. Builders carved these spells directly into the stone, confident that words etched into the walls would hold power long after the priest departed. Some chambers had hidden niches where small statues of protective gods were placed. These figures were positioned to watch over the king long after the tomb was sealed. The priests treated these niches with reverence because they believed the statues could sense both danger and devotion. Once the threshold ritual was complete, the priests guided the coffin into the chamber that awaited it. The threshold closed behind them, either with a massive stone slab or with a set of blocks designed to fall into place once the entourage exited. The closure was not meant to keep out thieves alone. It symbolized the final separation between the king's earthly body and the responsibilities he once carried. The living world remained on one side. The realm of eternity opened on the other. The threshold had performed its function, allowing the king to begin the next stage of his journey. For those who crossed it during the funeral rites, the memory of the threshold became a mark of honor and fear. They had walked where few were allowed to go. They had participated in a ceremony that shaped the destiny of a ruler believed to hold divine power. In their eyes, the threshold was not a stone doorway. It was a passage into a realm they could never fully understand, yet one they were duty-bound to serve. Their footsteps would fade. Their names would be forgotten. But the sacred threshold they crossed remained a testimony to a belief system that treated death as a continuation of royal order rather than its end. The great chambers inside the tombs of the pharaohs did not emerge from the desert through strength alone. They were imagined, calculated, and executed by individuals whose identities rarely appear in the historical record. These architects and master builders understood that they were shaping far more than stone. They were shaping the eternal home of a king whose journey through the afterlife required not only wealth and ritual, but a structure capable of guiding his spirit. Their work demanded secrecy, discipline, and extraordinary skill because every chamber, angle, corridor, and ceiling carried spiritual weight. These men, and the few women involved in mathematical design, formed a hidden community that dedicated their lives to a task greater than themselves. The process began long before the first stone was cut. The architects consulted astronomers and priests who specialized in cosmology. Together, they measured the sky with simple instruments made from wood, string, and polished metal. They watched the rising of Sirius and the movement of Orion, aligning their designs with celestial events believed to influence the afterlife. The burial chamber was often placed on a precise axis so that the spirit of the king could ascend toward the stars associated with rebirth and divine authority. Every degree mattered. A small misalignment could be interpreted as a failure in spiritual preparation. The architects carried the responsibility of ensuring that the king's soul had a clear path to the heavens. Once the orientation was decided, the planning of the internal chambers began. The architects prepared sketches on papyrus, knowing that very few people would ever see the results of their work once the tomb was sealed. They calculated proportions that balanced aesthetic symmetry with spiritual purpose. The ceiling height was chosen to reflect the sky goddess Nut, who was often depicted arching over the earth. The width of the burial chamber symbolized stability, invoking the eternal power of the earth god Geb. Even the length of the corridors served a purpose because it represented the journey through the underworld as described in funerary texts. Their calculations turned mythology into architecture and belief into physical form. The builders who executed these designs lived in isolated communities near the construction sites. They rose before sunrise and spent long hours carving stone, shaping blocks, and painting symbolic images under the direction of the master designers. They were sworn to secrecy because the layout of the tomb was considered sacred knowledge. Revealing the arrangement of chambers, hidden shafts, or sealed passages was believed to invite spiritual disaster. The workers understood that their craft served a divine function. This belief gave meaning to their labor, even when conditions were harsh and long hours wore down their bodies. Within the chambers, artisans added layers of meaning through decoration. Painters mixed pigments from crushed minerals, creating colors that had symbolic power. Blue represented the sky and the primeval waters. Red evoked strength and vitality. Gold was the flesh of the gods, and therefore reserved for the most important symbols. Carvers created relief scenes that showed the king interacting with deities who would guide him through the afterlife. These scenes were not random images. They served as instructions, prayers, and protective spells that worked in conjunction with the architecture itself. Together, they formed a system that transformed the chamber into a sacred environment designed to ensure the king's successful journey. The architects also designed mechanisms intended to protect the tomb from intrusion. These mechanisms ranged from massive stone blocks that slid into place after the burial to hidden passages that misled intruders. The designers used decoy chambers placed at different depths to confuse potential thieves. They shaped corridors with angles that disrupted simple navigation. Even the thickness of the walls served a protective function because thicker walls could withstand time and potential attacks. These protective measures were not created out of fear alone. They reflected the belief that the king's eternal rest required both physical and spiritual barriers. Despite their importance, the architects rarely left their names in the tombs they built. Most remained anonymous by tradition because the chamber belonged entirely to the king. Their roles were acknowledged only indirectly through marks on stones or notes on ostraca, discovered at nearby workers' villages. These small traces reveal the human effort behind monumental achievements. They also show the pride these individuals took in their craft. A single line written by a builder noting progress, or a name scratched onto a stone hidden deep inside the structure, offers a glimpse into the lives of the people who shaped these spaces. Their anonymity was part of the spiritual contract. The king's afterlife required their silence just as much as it required their skill. The architects understood that their work would unfold only once during the burial ceremony, and then disappear from the world of the living. This knowledge did not diminish their devotion. Instead, it heightened their sense of purpose. They created spaces meant to last thousands of years, trusting that their designs would remain intact long after their own lives ended. Their work connected them to the divine narrative of the kingdom. It allowed them to participate in the transformation of a ruler into an eternal presence. They built chambers that held not only the body of a king, but the belief system of an entire civilization. When we walk through these chambers today, we are not simply observing ancient architecture. We are standing in the legacy of individuals whose knowledge and craftsmanship shaped the ritual landscape of Egypt. The hidden architects built environments where the boundaries between the mortal world and the divine became blurred. Their work allowed the pharaoh to claim his place among the gods. Through their ingenuity and discipline, they created chambers that were both physical structures and sacred instruments of transformation. Their designs continue to speak through stone, revealing a story of devotion, intelligence, and faith that shaped the heart of Egyptian civilization. The journey into the inner chambers began long before the coffin reached the tomb. The preparation of the king's body was an elaborate process, guided by religious principles that shaped every action. It was believed that the body had to be preserved as a vessel capable of receiving the soul when it returned from its spiritual travels. This belief gave rise to methods of embalming that were more complex than anything practiced elsewhere in the ancient world. The embalmers worked with the understanding that their success determined whether the king would rise renewed in the afterlife or remain trapped in a state of spiritual vulnerability. The process started with the arrival of the royal physicians and the priests of Anubis who supervised the initial examination. They determined the condition of the body and selected the appropriate tools and resins for preservation. The embalmers performed their work in a secluded place along the Nile where the air, water, and soil were believed to hold purifying qualities. This separation allowed the workers to focus without the distractions of daily life and ensured that the rituals were carried out in an environment that provided spiritual balance. The entire process required 70 days, a period associated with cosmic cycles observed in the heavens. One of the first tasks involved removing the internal organs which were considered vulnerable to decay. The embalmers created a small incision on the left side of the abdomen using a blade made from obsidian. The organs were carefully removed and treated with resins, oils, and powders before being placed into canopic jars. Each jar bore the head of one of the 4 sons of Horus. These guardians protected the organs throughout eternity and played a symbolic role in guiding them through the trials of the afterlife. The heart, however, was never removed because it was believed to be the seat of memory, identity, and moral judgment. During the final judgment scene, the heart would be weighed against the feather of truth, and its presence was essential to the king's eternal fate. The embalmers then cleansed the body with water taken from the Nile and rinsed it with sacred oils. This step symbolized purification of both the physical form and the spiritual essence. Once cleansed, the body was packed with natron, a natural salt that absorbed moisture. The workers checked the progress regularly, ensuring that the preservation was even throughout the body. During this time, priests recited hymns that asked the gods to protect the king during his transition. These hymns echoed through the embalming chamber, creating an atmosphere that blended physical labor with spiritual intention. After the period of drying was complete, the embalmers filled the body with linen, sawdust, and aromatic herbs to restore its shape. This careful reconstruction reflected the belief that the king's body must resemble its living form so the soul would recognize it. The skin was treated with resins and oils that gave it a smooth, darkened appearance. These substances were considered gifts from the gods because they protected the body from decay and symbolized the divine radiance the king would possess in the afterlife. The wrapping process was one of the most intricate stages. Dozens of layers of linen were applied, each layer accompanied by the recitation of sacred formulas taken from funerary texts. These formulas were believed to activate protective forces that attached themselves to the wrappings. Amulets made from gold, lapis lazuli, carnelian, and faience were placed between the layers. Each amulet held symbolic meaning. The scarab ensured rebirth. The ankh granted life. The jade pillar provided stability. The wedjat eye protected the king from harm. The embalmers followed precise instructions that guided the placement of each object because the arrangement determined how effectively the charms would function. The face of the king was given special attention. A mask made from gold or gilded cartonnage was placed over the head and shoulders. This mask was more than a representation. It served as a divine face through which the king would be recognized by the gods. The features were shaped to portray calmness, strength, and eternal youth. These qualities reflected the transformation that awaited him. The mask created a link between the mortal form and the divine identity the king would assume in the afterlife. When the wrapping was complete, the embalmers performed the opening of the mouth ritual to restore the king's senses. Using tools shaped like small adzes, they touched the lips, eyes, and ears of the mummy while reciting invocations. This ritual symbolized awakening and reanimation. It ensured that the king could speak with authority, see the path ahead, hear the voices of the gods, and breathe the air of the next world. The embalmers believed that without this ritual, the body would lack the ability to function in its spiritual environment. The final stage involved dressing the mummy in linen garments and placing it inside one or more coffins crafted with detailed decoration. These coffins depicted protective deities and scenes from sacred texts. They were designed to function as protective shells that surrounded the king throughout eternity. Once enclosed, the coffin was placed inside the sarcophagus that awaited it in the burial chamber. This moment marked the completion of the embalmers' work. Their labor created a body capable of housing a soul that was destined to rule beyond death. Through this careful and sacred process, the king was prepared for the chambers that awaited him. The embalmers understood that their work formed the foundation of the king's eternal existence. Their knowledge, precision, and devotion transformed the body into a vessel of divine potential. Without their skill, the rituals that followed inside the hidden chambers would lose their power. Their contribution shaped the very heart of Egyptian beliefs about death, transformation, and eternal life. The journey from the embalming house to the burial chambers of the pharaoh was one of the most solemn rituals in ancient Egypt. It marked the transition from preparation to final passage and involved a procession that moved with deliberate slowness across sacred ground. This movement was not simply a funeral march. It was a reenactment of the cosmic journey that mirrored the sun god traveling through the night sky. Every participant, every gesture, and every object carried meaning. The priests, mourners, musicians, soldiers, and family members formed a living tapestry that reflected the beliefs of a society built upon harmony between the mortal world and the divine realm. The procession symbolized the beginning of the king's descent into darkness, where he would confront challenges before emerging renewed. The royal coffin was carried on a ceremonial sled rather than a wheeled cart, because the Egyptians believed that dragging emphasized connection with the earth. Workers tied ropes to the sled and pulled it along a path that had been cleared and often sprinkled with water to reduce friction. The movement of the sled created a low, steady sound that merged with the chants of the priests. These chants came from funerary texts that described the trials awaiting the king. Their voices rose and fell like waves, creating a rhythm that guided both the physical and spiritual progress of the procession. At the head of the column walked the lector priests, who carried papyrus scrolls containing sacred formulas. They recited these formulas to open and protect the path between worlds. The sound of their voices was steady and unwavering. Behind them came the priests of Anubis, wearing masks representing the jackal god. Their presence declared that the guardian of the dead walked beside the king. The Anubis priests carried tools for the final rites that would be performed once the coffin reached the inner chambers. Their disciplined steps reflected the seriousness of their role, because they believed that any misstep could disrupt the delicate boundary between life and death. Following the priests came musicians who played harps, flutes, and sistrums. Their music created an atmosphere that balanced sorrow with reverence. The sound of the harp echoed across the desert, blending with the wind and the distant cries of birds. These instruments represented harmony and order. They reminded all present that the king's journey was part of a cosmic cycle rather than a personal tragedy. The musicians understood that their melodies were believed to calm wandering spirits and protect the coffin from unseen forces that move between the worlds. Next came the mourners, primarily women chosen for their ability to express grief with controlled intensity. Their cries were rhythmic and ritualistic rather than uncontrolled displays of emotion. They chanted the king's names and titles, ensuring that his identity remained strong as he traveled deeper toward the burial site. Some mourners carried baskets filled with flowers, salt, and small offerings that would be placed inside the tomb. Others carried jars of perfumed oil. Their task symbolized the human sorrow felt at the passing of a ruler who represented the unity of the land. The family of the pharaoh walked near the coffin, but maintained a respectful distance. They wore garments of linen and strands of blue faience beads that protected against harmful influences. Their presence served as a reminder that although the king's earthly duties had ended, the continuation of the dynasty ensured the stability of the nation. Sons, daughters, and consorts moved with slow dignity, acknowledging both the loss of a ruler and the rise of a successor. Their gestures spoke of continuity, which was a central aspect of Egyptian belief. The death of a king was not an ending, but a transition into a cycle that balanced lineage, ritual, and cosmic order. Elite soldiers surrounded the group, holding spears, shields, and standards, representing different nomes and divisions of the army. Their role was both symbolic and practical. They defended the procession from potential disturbances and represented the military strength of the kingdom. Their presence reminded onlookers that the pharaoh, even in death, remained the protector of the land. The soldiers marched with precision, their steps forming a steady beat that matched the cadence of the priest's chants. As the procession approached the entrance to the tomb, the environment changed. The bright desert light dimmed as the group moved into the shadows cast by the cliffs of the necropolis. The temperature dropped slightly, and the sounds of the desert softened. The priests placed incense burners along the path leading down to the chambers. Thick smoke filled the air, creating a veil between the living and the spiritual world. The smell of myrrh and frankincense signaled purification and prepared the way for the final descent. At the entrance, the priests performed a brief series of prayers that acknowledged the transition from the world of sunlight to the world of darkness. They touched the coffin with tools shaped like miniature adzes and invoked protective deities. The music softened until only a single flute echoed through the space. When the priests lifted the first torch and stepped inside, the rest of the procession followed with slow, measured steps. The flickering light illuminated the painted walls, revealing scenes that guided the king through the underworld. The movement into the darkness symbolized the beginning of the king's confrontation with the unknown. Inside the first chamber, the coffin was placed on a wooden bier. Priests circled it repeatedly while reciting additional formulas. Their voices filled the confined space, resonating off the stone walls. The atmosphere grew heavy with the mixture of smoke, chants, and the awareness that the king stood on the threshold of eternity. The participants understood that their actions formed the bridge between worlds. Their movements and words shaped the environment in which the king would rise again. The procession into the darkness marked the moment where human presence gave way to the power of ritual. It combined physical effort, spiritual intention, and emotional expression into a single event that carried the king from the world he once ruled into the realm where he would seek renewal. Every step taken, every voice lifted, and every gesture performed contributed to the sacred atmosphere that prepared the king for the chambers that awaited him deep within the tomb. It was a journey that demonstrated the unity of a civilization shaped by belief in continuity, transformation, and the enduring presence of its pharaoh. The chamber that first received the coffin after the descent from the entrance was often called the Chamber of First Light. It represented the beginning of the king's journey through the inner world and held symbolic meaning connected to creation and rebirth. Although the chamber was lit only by torches during the burial, the Egyptians believed it was a place touched by the unseen light of the gods. The architecture reflected this belief through its careful alignment and the images painted on its walls. Everything inside the room served as a reminder that the king, though physically dead, was entering a new phase of existence that required guidance, protection, and clarity. The walls of this chamber were usually painted with scenes inspired by the dawn. Artists depicted the sky goddess Nut stretching across the ceiling, her body covered in stars that symbolized the eternal cycle of night and day. Her presence suggested that the king was being welcomed into a space where cosmic order held firm. Below her, the sun god Ra appeared rising from a lotus flower or sailing across the primeval waters. These images symbolized renewal and encouraged the king's spirit to follow the path of the sun. The artists created the scenes with bright pigments because color held spiritual force. Yellow echoed divine radiance. Blue represented the infinite sky. Red carried vitality and vigor. These colors created an environment that visually supported the transformation awaiting the king. Priests entered the chamber carrying torches that flickered against the decorated walls. The moving light caused the images to appear alive, reinforcing the belief that the gods were present during the burial ritual. The chamber was not silent. The low chanting of the priests echoed across the stone surfaces, creating a deep resonance that filled the room. These chants came from the Book of the Dead and other funerary texts that described the dangers of the underworld. The words acted as protective spells and formed an auditory shield around the king. The priests understood that their voices served as a bridge between the physical and spiritual realms. Once the coffin was placed on the wooden bier at the center of the chamber, the priests began a sequence of rituals that prepared the king for the deeper rooms of the tomb. They touched the coffin with small tools carved from wood, stone, and metal. Each tool represented a different function. Some ensured the king's senses remained active. Others symbolized the granting of power or protection. The movements were slow and deliberate because the priests believed that speed disrupted spiritual balance. Their gestures were part of a tradition refined across centuries and repeated during every royal burial with unwavering precision. The Chamber of First Light was also where offerings were presented before the king was moved deeper into the tomb. Workers carried baskets filled with bread, fruits, vegetables, and meats. They placed these offerings on low stone tables arranged along the walls. The priests sprinkled the food with water from the Nile to activate its spiritual essence. The presence of these offerings served not only a symbolic purpose, but also a magical one. The Egyptians believed that the king required nourishment during his journey through the afterlife. The offerings provided strength and stability as he faced trials described in funerary myths. One of the most meaningful rituals performed in this chamber involved the presentation of incense. Priests burned frankincense, myrrh, and cedar resin in bronze and ceramic burners. The thick smoke swirled upward, mixing with the dim light and creating patterns across the painted ceiling. This smoke was considered a medium through which prayers traveled to the gods. It purified the chamber and the objects within it. The fragrance served as a reminder that the king was entering a divine environment where earthly impurities had no place. The priests inhaled the scent carefully because they believed it strengthened their connection to the spiritual world. A notable feature of the Chamber of First Light was the presence of inscriptions carved into narrow stone panels near the entrance. These inscriptions declared the king's titles, achievements, and lineage. Their placement ensured that the king crossed a boundary marked by identity and authority. They reminded both the living and the gods that the individual lying in the coffin was not an ordinary person, but a ruler who had governed with divine sanction. The inscriptions preserved the king's legacy inside the tomb even after the world above changed. Their permanence reinforced the belief that words carved into stone held eternal power. Within the chamber, attendants carried out final inspections of the coffin. They checked the positioning of the amulets within the wrappings, the alignment of the mask, and the condition of the resin coatings. These tasks were performed with care because the king's appearance in the afterlife needed to reflect dignity and divine radiance. The attendants worked with calm seriousness, aware that mistakes could compromise the rituals that followed. Their roles were often overlooked by historians, yet they formed an essential part of the burial process, ensuring that practical matters supported spiritual beliefs. As the priests completed their rites, they signaled the transition to the next phase by lowering their torches and reciting a concluding hymn. The flame of each torch illuminated the coffin briefly before the priests lifted it once more. The bier was raised slowly, allowing the light to play across the gilded surface. The chamber seemed to grow warmer for a moment as the smoke thickened. When the procession moved again, the chamber fell into near silence, except for the faint sound of footsteps echoing across the stone floor. The departure marked the understanding that the king had absorbed the blessings of first light and was prepared to face the deeper mysteries of the tomb. The chamber of first light served as the threshold between preparation and transformation. It combined artistic symbolism, ritual precision, and architectural design to create a space where the king could receive protection and guidance before descending into the darker and more complex chambers that awaited him. The Egyptians believed that without this initial passage through a place dedicated to dawn and renewal, the king's journey through the afterlife would lack the direction needed to reach rebirth. This chamber stood as the beginning of the spiritual path within the tomb, shaped by a civilization that honored continuity, cosmic harmony, and the eternal presence of its ruler. The deeper chambers of a pharaoh's tomb were not defined by darkness alone. They were illuminated by an intricate visual language created through color, symbolism, and artistry. Every pigment applied to the walls carried theological purpose, and every image drawn upon the stone served as a conduit between the mortal king and the divine realm he sought to enter. The Egyptians understood color as a form of living power. They believed that pigments retained their spiritual qualities long after the tomb was sealed. Because of this belief, the preparation of paints, the selection of minerals, and the placement of each hue reflected a deliberate philosophy that connected art with ritual and cosmic order. The process began with the artisans who worked under the direction of the high priests and master architects. These artisans were specialists trained from childhood to read and create the visual language of the gods. Before touching the walls, they purified themselves through washing and incense rituals. Purity was believed to strengthen the hand and the mind, because painting a royal tomb involved more than technical skill. It required spiritual focus. The artists mixed pigments from minerals gathered across the deserts, quarries, and riverbanks of Egypt. Lapis lazuli, imported from distant trade routes, created a deep blue believed to represent the heavens and the waters that surrounded the world. Malachite produced a green associated with growth, health, and the resurrection of Osiris. Red ochre symbolized life and energy. Yellow ochre carried the radiance of sunlight. Black represented the fertile soil of the Nile and the mystery of night. These colors formed the palette from which the artisans shaped the future of the king. Before the walls were painted, they were prepared with layers of plaster. This plaster created a smooth surface capable of holding color for an eternity. The artisans ground the stone until it felt cool and even beneath their hands. They tested small patches with watered pigments to ensure that the surface absorbed the color evenly. These early steps were essential because imperfections could break the continuity of spiritual scenes. Once satisfied, the artist used thin red lines to sketch the outlines of figures, gods, boats, and symbols. These initial sketches served as the structure upon which the final images would be completed. The layout of the scenes followed a strict visual order that guided the king through the afterlife. The upper register might depict celestial events or protective deities watching from the heavens. The middle register often portrayed the king interacting with gods who welcomed him, judged him, or granted him authority. The lower register depicted offerings, rituals, or scenes from the underworld. These layers reflected the Egyptian understanding of the cosmos, where heaven, earth, and the realm of the dead were connected through pathways that only the king could traverse. By arranging the scenes in this manner, the artisans created a visual map intended to help the king navigate the challenges beyond the tomb. The act of painting involved more than placing color onto stone. It required the artist to infuse each image with symbolic purpose. When they painted the skin of the gods in gold, they were not representing physical appearance. They were invoking the divine flesh believed to be eternal and incorruptible. When they depicted the god Osiris in green, they were emphasizing resurrection and renewal. When they painted the king in reddish-brown tones, they were connecting him to the land he once ruled. Each color carried layers of meaning understood by priests and spirits alike. The artisans worked in groups, each responsible for a specific part of the wall. Some focused on backgrounds, blending colors to create smooth gradients that represented the sky or the horizon. Others specialized in the detailed features of the gods, shaping eyes, crowns, and jewelry with careful precision. A separate group concentrated on writing the hieroglyphic texts that accompanied the scenes. These texts contained spells, prayers, and instructions. The placement of these inscriptions required perfect alignment because a single misplaced symbol could disrupt the meaning of the entire passage. The artisans understood their responsibility and approached each stroke with disciplined concentration. Once the paintings were complete, the priests performed a series of rituals to animate the images. They believed that through these rites, the figures painted on the walls gained the ability to act within the spiritual realm. This activation ensured that the gods depicted would protect, guide, or judge the king as necessary. The priests walked slowly around the chamber while chanting formulas that activated the colors. They passed incense burners before each wall, allowing the smoke to merge with the pigments and enhance their power. Through these acts, the walls ceased to be simple decorations. They became living elements of the tomb's sacred environment. The chamber itself transformed as the colors settled into the stone. The torches cast moving light that made the scenes appear dynamic. The goddesses stretched across the ceiling seemed to shimmer. The boats of the sun god appeared to glide across the painted waters. The protective deity standing near the hieroglyphs appeared watchful and alert. The artists designed the scenes with this movement in mind because they understood that flickering light created a sense of presence within the confined space. The palette of gods and kings reflected the Egyptian belief that art was inseparable from ritual, identity, and cosmic order. The colors within these chambers carried the king from the physical world into the spiritual one, shaping both his journey and his protection. The artisans who created these images understood that their work was meant to last for eternity. Their pigments and symbols formed a silent narrative that continued to guide the king long after the tomb was sealed. Through their mastery, the chambers became more than rooms carved from stone. They became sacred landscapes where the king could walk among gods and find his place within the eternal cycle of life, death, and rebirth. As the priests and attendants carried the coffin deeper into the tomb, they entered sections of the structure that were unknown even to many of the workers who helped build it. These hidden areas represented one of the most sophisticated features of Egyptian royal burial architecture. The ancient builders designed secret doors, concealed passages, and false chambers to guard the king's spiritual journey and protect his body from worldly threats. These features reflected a belief that the afterlife resembled a vast and complex landscape, filled with paths that needed guidance and dangers that required careful avoidance. The architecture of secrecy within the tomb served both practical and spiritual purposes, shaping the perception of the chambers as an environment of guarded mystery. The first hidden doorway usually appeared shortly after the chamber of first light. It was carved into the wall and covered so skillfully that only a trained priest or architect could identify it. The stone panel matched the surrounding surface in texture, color, and alignment. Even the seams between blocks were disguised with plaster and pigment. These secret doors were designed to open only during the burial ritual and would remain sealed once the priests completed their work. The presence of such doors reflected an older tradition in which tombs were repeatedly robbed, forcing architects to create methods of misdirecting intruders while preserving the sacred core of the structure. Beyond the first concealed door lay a corridor often lined with images that depicted guardians of the underworld. These guardians were shown in elaborate poses with animal heads, staffs, or protective amulets. Their presence served as both warning and protection. The Egyptians believed that these figures acted as spiritual sentinels once the chamber was sealed. They ensured that only the rightful soul of the king could pass. Their images were activated through ritual when the priests completed the final stages of the burial. Once activated, they were believed to stand watch in silence for eternity. Some tombs included false passages carved to mislead intruders. These passages appeared convincing at first glance, complete with inscribed walls and decorative imagery. However, they ended abruptly in dead ends or ceilings that collapsed upon entry. The architects used knowledge of pressure points and block weights to construct such traps. While this may appear purely defensive, the Egyptians understood it as part of the spiritual safeguard surrounding the king. In their worldview, protecting the physical body supported the spiritual journey, because preservation of the body ensured that the soul had a vessel to return to. One of the most intriguing features in these deeper chambers was the presence of swinging stone doors mounted on concealed pivots. These doors were cut from single pieces of limestone or granite and weighed several hundred kilograms. To create the illusion that the door was part of the wall, artisans carved its edges to mimic the surrounding stone blocks. The pivot points were hidden inside recesses that allowed the massive slab to swing inward or outward without revealing its mechanism. The architects perfected this technique over centuries, using mathematics and experience passed through generations of builders. The priests who participated in the burial ritual were trained to open these doors with precision. They understood the pressure needed to shift the slabs and the chants that accompanied the movement. Each opening represented the passage from one phase of the afterlife to another. The king's coffin moved through these thresholds as though moving through the gates described in funerary texts. The priests recited hymns that spoke of the gates of the underworld, which were guarded by serpents, demons, and powerful spirits. These hymns declared the king's authority and allowed him to pass unharmed. Some of the concealed chambers contained objects meant to function only in the spiritual world. These included miniature boats representing the solar bark, statues of deities placed in niches, and sealed jars that contained oils, unguents, or symbolic food offerings. These objects were hidden from the view of intruders to preserve their power. The Egyptians believed that objects in the tomb were not merely physical items, but spiritual tools that the king would need during his journey. By concealing them behind secret doors, the architects ensured they remained untouched. There were also symbolic doors painted onto the walls. These false doors represented portals through which the king's Ka, or life force, could move between the tomb and the world beyond. The painted doors were designed with great detail, showing bolts, wooden beams, and ornamental carvings. They served as spiritual points of entry rather than physical ones. The Egyptians believed that while the body remained inside the stone rooms, the Ka could pass through these painted thresholds to receive offerings placed by priests and family members in the chapel above. One of the final concealed doors led to the inner sanctum where the sarcophagus awaited. This door was often the most carefully disguised because it protected the most sacred space within the entire structure. It symbolized the transition from the mortal realm to the divine center of the tomb. The priests used torches to illuminate the faint outlines of the hidden seams. They pressed against the correct stones in rhythmic sequence until the panel shifted with a deep, slow movement that echoed across the corridor. The opening of this final door marked the moment when the king entered the heart of eternity. After the burial ceremony, the priests sealed each hidden door with plaster mixed from groundstone and water. They smoothed the surfaces until the seams vanished from sight. The torches were extinguished one by one as they retreated toward the outer chambers. When the last priest stepped through the threshold and the entrance was sealed forever, the secret doors became part of a silent labyrinth known only to the gods and the spirit of the king. Their concealed presence remained intact beneath sand and stone, forming a network of passages designed to safeguard a ruler who had passed from the world of light into the realm of everlasting night. As the priests advanced with the coffin through the narrowing corridors, they entered a chamber dedicated to one of the most profound elements of the Pharaoh's transition, the restoration of breath. For the Egyptians, breath was not simply the movement of air. It was the essence of existence, a force tied to creation, identity, and continuity. The tomb's chamber of eternal breath embodied this belief through ritual acts and symbolic images that ensured the king would inhale the winds of the afterlife and sustain his new form. The Egyptians treated breath as a divine inheritance connected to the gods who shaped the universe. This chamber was designed to protect and renew that inheritance for the king who had governed the land. The walls of the chamber depicted scenes of the god Shu lifting the sky above the earth. Shu embodied air, lightness, and the space needed for life to exist. His presence within the chamber emphasized that the king's journey required the support of cosmic forces. Artists painted Shu with arms stretched wide, holding the heavens aloft. His figure dominated the upper register of the wall, and his presence reminded the priests that breath existed between the worlds. The Egyptians believed that Shu controlled the space through which the king's soul would rise. His image created a sense of expansiveness even within the confined stone room. Below Shu, the goddess Hathor appeared offering jars of scented air. These jars symbolized the breath of life, and the Egyptians believed that the fragrances they contained could revive the senses of the king. Hathor's hands extended gently toward the coffin's path, suggesting an invitation to breathe again. Her imagery represented comfort, renewal, and divine acceptance. The priests paused before her image and waved incense burners to honor her role. The smoke drifted upward in layers that curled toward the painted ceiling. The movement of the smoke reflected the Egyptians' belief that sacred air carried prayers to the gods. An essential part of the ritual performed here involved the opening of the mouth ceremony. Although the priests had begun this ritual earlier, the chamber of eternal breath required a repeated and expanded version. The lead priest approached the coffin with a set of ceremonial tools shaped from metal and carved from fine wood. Each tool symbolized one of the senses, and the priest used them in a sequence that suggested awakening. He touched the lips of the coffin gently, invoking the power of breath. The Egyptians believed that breath was not fully restored until this ritual was completed within the chamber built specifically for its activation. Torches illuminated the room, casting moving light against the painted walls. The flickering flames created the illusion that Shu and Hathor were breathing with the priests. This effect reinforced the belief that the spiritual world was active within the space. The Egyptians designed the chamber to encourage such impressions. The ceiling was often curved slightly to resemble the arch of the sky goddess Nut, creating a sense of openness above. The combination of moving light, colorful imagery, and aromatic smoke produced an atmosphere where the physical and spiritual seemed to merge. Hieroglyphic inscriptions carved along the lower sections of the wall described the power of air in the afterlife. These inscriptions included spells that granted the king the ability to breathe, even in the deepest regions of the underworld. They also warned hostile forces that the king possessed divine breath and was protected by deities who governed the winds. The inscriptions were detailed and precise, reflecting the belief that the written word held living power. Once activated through ritual, the words provided ongoing support to the king's spirit. The priests carried small clay vessels filled with perfumed oils that they opened one by one as they circled the coffin. The fragrance of each oil represented a specific aspect of renewal. One smelled of lotus, symbolizing rebirth. Another smelled of cedar, representing stability. A third contained myrrh, associated with divine presence. The priests released these scents into the air, believing that the king inhaled them through his restored senses. The fragrances merged with the incense and created a multi-layered aroma that filled the chamber. This blend of scents was designed to strengthen the king's spirit and prepare him for the deeper mysteries that awaited. Statues of protective deities stood in the corners of the chamber. Each statue was carved with open nostrils to symbolize alertness and the power to sense danger. These figures included gods like Serket, who protected against venom and chaos, and Bez, who drove away malevolent spirits. Their carved forms watched the ritual with unwavering stillness. The Egyptians believed that the presence of these statues enhanced the sacred air within the chamber. They guarded the king as his breath returned and shielded him from forces that might seek to extinguish it. The chamber of eternal breath also contained vents carved with symbolic purpose. These vents were not intended to provide airflow for the living, but to represent the movement of spiritual winds. Some vents were shaped to resemble feathers, linking them to the goddess Ma'at, who embodied truth and cosmic balance. Others were carved as narrow slits that mimicked the patterns of desert winds. The Egyptians viewed these vents as conduits through which sacred air entered the tomb. Their placement reflected an understanding of the relationship between architecture and belief. They transformed solid stone into a living structure that interacted with invisible forces. As the ritual concluded, the priests placed small amulets shaped like lungs upon the wrappings of the king. These amulets were made from faience, or gold, and represented the restoration of vitality. The priests recited a final sequence of chants that asked the gods to grant the king breath throughout eternity. Their voices echoed in the chamber, blending with the fading smoke. The moment carried profound meaning because breath symbolized the difference between silence and awareness, between stillness and movement, between death and the divine continuation of life. The chamber of eternal breath represented the Egyptians' deep understanding of life as a mixture of physical and spiritual forces. Through visual symbolism, ritual precision, and scents that filled the air, the chamber restored what death seemed to take away. It ensured that the pharaoh would inhale the winds of the afterlife and continue his journey with strength. This space revealed a civilization that honored breath not as a simple biological function, but as a sacred element connected to the gods who shaped creation and the kings who ruled beneath their watch. As the priests guided the coffin deeper into the tomb, they approached the most symbolically complex region of the structure. This area, often called the Labyrinth of Judgment, represented the trials the king would face in the afterlife. The Egyptians believed that death did not grant immediate entry into eternal peace. Instead, the soul needed to demonstrate purity, truthfulness, and strength as it navigated the underworld. The labyrinth embodied these trials through architectural design, painted scenes, and ritual inscriptions. Every passage, every turn, and every chamber reflected a stage of judgment described in sacred texts. The pharaoh, even in death, needed to prove that he was worthy of joining the company of the gods. The walls of the labyrinth displayed scenes from the Book of Gates and the Book of Caverns. These texts depicted the 12 stages the sun god passed through during the night. Each stage contained guardians, challenges, and transformative moments. The artisans painted these scenes with vivid colors and precise detail. The images showed serpents larger than boats, spirits with human bodies and animal heads, and figures of divine judges seated on thrones. These scenes were not intended to frighten the priests who conducted the ritual. They were reminders of the spiritual journey the king must walk. The labyrinth transformed myth into architecture, allowing the pharaoh to step into the cosmic narrative of night and rebirth. The corridors in this region were designed with deliberate complexity. Some were narrow enough that only one person could walk through at a time, creating an atmosphere of confinement. Others widened into small chambers where the priests paused to recite protective spells. The ceilings varied in height. Some were low, forcing the priests to bow their heads in acknowledgement of the gods depicted above. Others rose into arches, painted with stars to resemble the night sky. The architectural choices were symbolic rather than decorative. They reflected the shifting landscape of the underworld, where open paths and constricted passages existed side by side. At several points within the labyrinth, the priests encountered painted gates. These gates represented the boundaries between different stages of the afterlife. Each gate had its own guardian, often depicted as a hybrid being, with the body of a man and the head of a fierce creature. These beings held knives, staffs, or scepters, and were accompanied by inscriptions that described the nature of their authority. The priests recited the appropriate spells as they passed each gate to symbolically grant the king access to the next stage. The Egyptians believed that without these rituals, the gates would remain closed, and the king's spirit would be unable to continue its journey. One of the most important chambers within the labyrinth contained the weighing of the heart. Although the actual weighing occurred only in the spiritual realm, its imagery was essential to the tomb. The walls depicted the god Anubis adjusting the scales, the goddess Ma'at standing nearby with her feather of truth, and the monstrous Amit waiting to consume the hearts of the unworthy. The king was shown standing before the scales, offering his declarations of innocence. These scenes established the moral dimension of the afterlife. They reminded all who entered the chamber that truth, balance, and justice were the foundations of eternal existence. The priests paused in this chamber and recited the negative confessions on behalf of the king. These confessions were a series of statements that declared the king's purity. He had not stolen, he had not lied, he had not caused suffering without cause, and he had not violated sacred boundaries. The priests spoke these words with clarity, believing that each declaration strengthened the king's spiritual standing. Their voices filled the room and reverberated against the stone walls, merging with the painted scenes surrounding them. The Egyptians believed that spoken words carried enduring power, so the recitation embedded the king's innocence within the structure itself. Architecturally, the labyrinth also served a protective function. Its complex design discouraged tomb robbers by creating confusion and forcing intruders to navigate multiple turns, dead ends, and concealed pathways. Some corridors led to false chambers decorated with misleading images. Others contained hidden pits that appeared harmless until weight was applied to cleverly designed pressure stones. These features demonstrated the dual purpose of the labyrinth. While it symbolized spiritual trials, it also physically protected the king's body from disturbance. The Egyptians understood that preserving the body preserved the soul's ability to return, so physical protection carried sacred importance. The priests continued their passage with slow, deliberate movements. Their torches cast shifting shadows across the walls, making the painted figures seem to watch them. The air grew still and the temperature cooled as they approached the heart of the labyrinth. The ritual atmosphere deepened, and the priests' awareness of their surroundings sharpened. They believed that the spiritual presence within the labyrinth intensified near the central chamber, where judgment reached its symbolic peak. That chamber contained inscriptions describing the triumph of the righteous soul. Here the king was shown greeted by Osiris, lord of the underworld, who offered him a place within the eternal cycle of rebirth. The walls portrayed scenes of victory rather than trial. The imagery shifted from darkness to light, from confinement to expanse, from tension to acceptance. The priest's chants softened as they acknowledged the symbolic completion of judgment. The king had passed through the trials represented by the labyrinth and stood ready for the next stage of his journey. The labyrinth of judgment stood as one of the most profound regions within the tomb. It symbolized the moral and spiritual trials the king needed to overcome before achieving eternal existence. Through its images, architecture, and rituals, the labyrinth transformed the tomb into a sacred landscape that mirrored the trials described in the sacred texts. It represented the Egyptian belief that even kings were accountable to cosmic law, and that truth and balance governed both life and death. Its presence within the burial structure revealed the depth of Egyptian understanding about the journey of the soul, shaping a narrative that blended myth, morality, and the pursuit of eternal harmony. After passing through the labyrinth of judgment, the priests guiding the king's coffin entered a region of the tomb associated with the most sacred transformation of all. This part of the structure symbolized the moment when the king left his mortal state and assumed his role as a divine being. The Egyptians believed that the afterlife required more than protection, guidance, and moral purity. It required union with the gods. Only through this union could the king gain the power he needed to rise within the celestial realm and join the eternal cycle governed by the divine forces of creation. This chamber represented the merging of mortal legacy with cosmic destiny. The walls of the chamber were adorned with scenes showing the king in the presence of gods who played roles in his transformation. The most prominent among them was Osiris, whose presence embodied death, resurrection, and eternal rulership. Artists painted Osiris seated on a throne holding the crook and flail, symbolizing authority and protection. The king was shown standing before him, offering gifts that represented devotion and readiness. These images illustrated the spiritual agreement between ruler and deity. By presenting himself before Osiris, the king demonstrated faithfulness to the cosmic order, By accepting him, Osiris granted access to divine renewal. Next to Osiris appeared the goddess Isis, whose role in resurrection made her essential to the king's transformation. She was depicted with her wings spread wide, forming a protective embrace around the king. Her presence symbolized the nurturing force required for rebirth. The priests paused before her image and raised their torches as if inviting her blessing. They believed that her power extended across the tomb, filling the chamber with a quiet strength. The ritual atmosphere grew heavier with incense as the priests recited hymns dedicated to her guidance. These hymns invoked her ability to restore life and awaken divine potential in those who sought her aid. Another important figure present in the chamber was the god Horus. He represented kingship, protection, and celestial authority. Artists depicted him with a falcon's head, often holding a staff or ankh. His presence affirmed that the king's rightful place in the divine hierarchy was inherited through an unbroken line of rulers. The Egyptians believed that the living king was the earthly manifestation of Horus, while the deceased king became associated with Osiris. This transition reflected a cycle of rulership where the throne passed from father to son, both spiritually and politically. The chamber celebrated this continuity through its imagery. Rituals performed in this chamber centered on uniting the king with these deities. The lead priest carried a small statue representing the K of the king. This statue symbolized the spiritual double that accompanied the individual in life and death. The priest placed the statue before each deity's image, performing gestures that signaled acceptance. These gestures included lifting the statue toward the painted figures and touching it gently with ritual objects. The Egyptians believed that this process allowed the Ka to merge with the divine forces represented in the chamber. Such union strengthened the king's identity in the afterlife. The priests also presented offerings of food, drink, oils, and incense as part of the ritual. Baskets containing bread, figs, dates, and roasted meats were placed at the foot of the wall. Jars of beer and wine were opened, allowing their fragrances to fill the air. These offerings symbolized gratitude and sustained the king during his spiritual ascent. The oils carried powerful scents such as lotus, cinnamon, and cedar. Their fragrances were believed to attract the presence of gods and sanctify the environment. The priests poured a thin stream of oil onto the floor in a slow and deliberate pattern that represented a pathway between the mortal and divine realms. Inscriptions carved into the walls spoke of the divine union in poetic detail. They described the moment when the king rose as a living god and joined the company of deities who governed the cosmos. The inscriptions declared that the king's heart was pure, his name eternal, and his form renewed. They praised gods who embraced him and granted him the power to walk among the stars. These written passages served as both affirmation and invocation. They ensured that the king's divine transformation would endure as long as the tomb remained intact. A notable ritual in this chamber involved the application of sacred oils to the coffin. Priests dipped small brushes into bowls of perfumed resin and touched the coffin in precise locations. These locations corresponded to points believed to contain spiritual power. The ritual symbolized anointing, purification, and divine acceptance. The Egyptians believed that through this act, the king's body became imbued with the essence of the gods. The fragrance of the oils lingered in the chamber long after the priests completed their work, creating an atmosphere that blended solemnity with transcendence. The torches used during the rituals cast shifting light across the images on the wall. The movement of the flames created the illusion that the gods themselves were moving within the chamber. This effect enhanced the sense of divine presence. The priests experienced these moments with reverence, convinced that they stood in a place where mortal and divine forces merged. Their chants softened as they acknowledged the completion of the union between king and deity. When the rituals ended, the priests lifted the coffin and prepared to move it deeper into the tomb. The chamber remained filled with the scent of incense and oil. The painted figures of Osiris, Isis, and Horus appeared luminous in the fading torchlight. Their presence marked the turning point in the king's journey. He was no longer simply a ruler undergoing burial rites. He was a divine being ready to enter the final regions of the tomb, where his eternal form awaited. The rituals of divine union represented the heart of the Egyptian belief in the continuity of kingship and the inseparable connection between the mortal and divine worlds. Through symbolic gestures, sacred offerings, and precise invocations, the priests ensured that the pharaoh ascended beyond the realm of human experience. This chamber stood as a testament to the belief that rulership extended beyond death, and that the king's divine identity shaped the fate of the land he once governed. The union forged here prepared him for the final transformation, awaiting deeper within the sacred chambers of his tomb. As the priests carried the king's coffin onward from the chamber of nightfall, they reached a section of the tomb that held one of its most important collections of ritual objects. This chamber, known as the Sanctum of Sacred Vessels, housed the containers, jars, and symbolic items that preserved the king's essence. These vessels were not mere funerary objects. They served as guardians of the king's identity, memory, and spiritual functions. The Egyptians believed that every aspect of a person, whether physical or spiritual, needed preservation to ensure a successful journey into eternity. The sanctum reflected this belief through the careful placement of items that supported the king even after death. The most prominent objects within the room were the canopic jars. These jars contained the preserved organs of the king, each guarded by one of the four sons of Horus. The jars were positioned on a stone platform, carved directly into the floor. Artists painted the lids with human and animal heads, representing the protectors. Imsidi guarded the liver. Hapi guarded the lungs. Duamutef guarded the stomach. Chebe Senuef guarded the intestines. Their presence symbolized balance and order. The Egyptians believed that without these guardians, the organs would be vulnerable to spiritual harm. The jars were more than containers. They were active protectors in the king's journey. The chamber's walls displayed scenes of these guardians, offering blessings over the vessels. Hieroglyphic inscriptions surrounded the images and described the powers associated with each jar. These texts emphasized the importance of protecting the internal organs because they played a symbolic role in the afterlife. Although the body itself no longer needed them physically, the spiritual representations of these organs remained essential. The Egyptians viewed every organ as connected to a specific part of the self. The sanctum preserved these connections through ritual and design. Next to the canopic jars stood another set of vessels intended to nourish the king. These jars contained sacred oils, perfumes, milk, wine, and water. Their shapes varied from slender alabaster bottles to wide ceramic jars. Priests believed that each liquid possessed spiritual qualities necessary for the king's renewal. Milk symbolized purity. Wine represented vitality. Water reflected the life-giving force of the Nile. Perfumed oils embodied divine presence. By storing these liquids in vessels placed within the sanctum, the Egyptians ensured that the king would have access to these symbolic substances during his transition through the unseen world. The chamber also contained sealed chests filled with linen garments, sandals, and personal items used by the king during life. These objects had symbolic importance rather than practical purpose. The Egyptians believed that items familiar to the king created comfort and stability in the afterlife. They helped the spirit recognize itself. The inclusion of clothing reflected the idea that the king needed both physical and spiritual adornment. Linen held special significance because it represented purity and divine cleanliness. Priests folded each garment with great care, believing that their arrangement contributed to order within the chamber. Another set of vessels contained offerings of grain, seeds, and dried fruits. These items symbolized renewal and the promise of regeneration. Grain represented the cycle of death and rebirth because it sprouted only after burial within the soil. Seeds represented potential. Dried fruits symbolized abundance. The Egyptians believed that by placing these offerings in the sanctum, they aligned the king with the agricultural cycles that shaped life along the Nile. These cycles mirrored the transformations he would undergo in the afterlife. Torches lit the room as the priests approached the sacred vessels. The flames illuminated the polished surfaces of the jars, casting reflections that moved slowly along the walls. The priests recited formulas that honored the four sons of Horus and invoked the protection of the goddesses who watched over each organ. Isis guarded Imseti, Nephthys guarded Hapi, Neith guarded Duamutef, Selket guarded Kebesenuef. Their names echoed through the chamber as the priests acknowledged their roles. The Egyptians believed that the presence of these goddesses strengthened the spiritual protection surrounding the vessels. A central ritual took place within this chamber. The priests touched each vessel with a ceremonial wand carved from dark wood. This wand represented authority over spiritual forces. By tapping the jars gently, the priests awakened the protective powers contained within them. Each tap was followed by a spoken invocation. The ritual required precision because the Egyptians believed that a poorly performed activation could weaken the protective shield surrounding the king. The priests moved slowly from vessel to vessel, creating a rhythm that filled the chamber with steady sound. The architecture of the sanctum suggested containment and preservation. The room was rectangular with high walls designed to hold steady temperatures. The stone surfaces kept the air cool and controlled, which supported the physical preservation of the vessels. Small decorative alcoves lined the walls, each containing additional offerings such as beads, amulets, and carved figurines. These items enhanced the spiritual power of the room. Their presence reminded the priests that every detail mattered in shaping the king's eternal environment. The sanctum represented the Egyptians' understanding that preservation extended beyond the physical body. It applied to identity, memory, and spiritual essence. The vessels stored within this chamber formed the foundation of the king's eternal form. They supported his journey and strengthened his ability to rise again. The Egyptians believed that without these sacred objects, the king would lack essential parts of himself. The sanctum ensured that nothing meaningful was left behind. Before departing, the priests bowed before the canopic jars and extinguished several lamps, leaving only a few to burn. Their retreat signaled that the vessels had been fully activated and were ready to serve the king. The chamber fell into a soft glow as the priests carried the coffin toward the deeper rooms waiting ahead. The sanctum of sacred vessels remained behind them as a repository of memory, identity, and divine protection. It stood as a testament to a civilization that believed the path to eternity required the careful preservation of every part of the self. As the priests carried the king's coffin farther into the depths of the tomb, they reached a chamber unlike any they had entered before. This room, known as the Vault of Cosmic Maps, held the knowledge that guided the pharaoh through the unseen regions of the afterlife. The Egyptians did not imagine the next world as a place of vague mystery. They believed it possessed structure, boundaries, and pathways. The vault preserved this understanding through elaborate paintings, diagrams, and symbolic maps that depicted routes taken by gods, stars, and spirits. The chamber served as a celestial guidebook crafted in stone, offering the king direction as he traveled through eternity. The walls of this chamber were divided into long horizontal bands. Each band displayed a different region of the afterlife. Some sections portrayed rivers flowing through shadowed valleys, while others showed islands surrounded by celestial waters. Artists depicted boats crossing these waters, guided by deities who protected the souls of the righteous. The colors were soft but purposeful. Deep blues represented the cosmic ocean. Pale golds reflected the light of divine presence. Red signified regions where danger or trial awaited. These maps did not show physical places, but symbolic landscapes understood through generations of ritual knowledge. One of the most striking features of the vault was the presence of star maps. The ceiling displayed constellations known to Egyptian astronomers who observed the night sky carefully over centuries. These constellations served as guides for the king's spirit. They included the circumpolar stars known as the imperishables because they never dipped below the horizon. The Egyptians believed that these stars represented eternal existence. By placing their images above the king's path, the artisans reinforced the promise of immortality. The priests raised their torches to illuminate the star-filled ceiling, watching as the flickering light made the painted sky appear to move. The lower registers of the wall contained diagrams from the Book of the Night and the Book of Day. These texts described the journey of the sun god as he traveled through the two halves of the sky. The images showed Ra emerging from a serpent at dawn, traveling across the heavens, descending through the western horizon, and passing through the underworld before rising again. The Egyptians believed that by aligning the pharaoh with this cycle, they ensured his participation in the eternal rhythm of light and shadow. The priests paused at these scenes and recited lines from the funerary texts that described the paths of the sun. Another panel displayed scenes from the Book of Two Ways. This ancient text provided two distinct routes through the afterlife. One path contained water and required the soul to travel by boat. The other was a land route marked by gateways and guardians. The maps in the chamber mirrored this structure. They showed the paths branching apart and rejoining in places where purification or trial occurred. The Egyptians believed that these options reflected the king's versatility and strength. By knowing both routes, he could adapt to challenges that might arise during his journey. The vault of cosmic maps also contained diagrams of the Duat, the realm of the dead. These diagrams were complex and detailed. They showed winding tunnels, caverns filled with spirits, and fields where the blessed harvested crops for eternity. Among these landscapes were lakes of fire where the unworthy faced punishment. The Egyptians did not include these scenes to instill fear. Instead, they offered clarity. The maps provided warnings about areas to avoid and instructions for addressing hostile forces. They emphasized the importance of knowledge as a protective tool. Priests performed specific rituals in this chamber to activate the maps. They traced sections of the diagrams with wands made from acacia wood, moving slowly along the painted paths. Each movement symbolized opening the routes for the king's spirit. The priests spoke the names of rivers, mountains, and guardians as they traced the drawings. The Egyptians believed that calling these names aloud awakened the forces associated with them. Through this ritual, the maps became more than images. They became living guides that responded to the king's presence. Small niches carved into the side walls held miniature boats carved from wood or stone. These boats symbolized the vessels used by the gods and the blessed dead to travel across the cosmic waters. Some boats carried figures of deities standing at the bow. Others held oars to symbolize movement. The priests lifted one of these models and touched it to the coffin, invoking the power of safe passage. The placement of these boats within the vault underscored the importance of navigation in the afterlife. Hieroglyphic texts carved between the panels provided instructions for the king. They described the correct prayers to speak at each gate, the gestures needed to appease guardians, and the offerings required to cross certain boundaries. These texts were sequences of sacred knowledge passed down across generations. They served as a manual for traversing regions where chaos lurked. The Egyptians believed that the king, armed with this knowledge, would move confidently through the afterlife. The priests understood that this chamber represented one of the most intellectual aspects of the burial structure. It reflected a belief system rooted not only in ritual but also in observation. Egyptian astronomers tracked celestial movements carefully, creating a blend of science and spirituality that shaped the maps. The vault demonstrated how deeply the Egyptians valued order. It revealed their conviction that everything in the universe was connected, from the movement of the stars to the path of a king entering eternity. When the rituals ended, the priests bowed before the cosmic maps and lifted the coffin once again. The chamber remained illuminated by a constellation of torchlight, the images of the sky and underworld shimmering across the walls. As the priest stepped into the next corridor, the map stayed behind, etched in stone to serve as the king's eternal compass. The vault of cosmic maps stood as a testament to a civilization that believed knowledge guided the soul as surely as ritual, and that understanding the universe was essential to navigating the afterlife. As the priests emerged from the passage of silent echoes, the air grew warmer, and the space widened into a chamber, marked by grandeur unlike anything they had encountered earlier. This room, known as the Chamber of the Golden Sarcophagus, served as the heart of the tomb. It was the place where the pharaoh would finally rest, within a vessel crafted to hold not only his body, but also his immortal identity. The Egyptians believed that the sarcophagus was more than a container. It was a throne, a protective shell, and a divine cradle that prepared the king for his eternal ascent. The chamber reflected this belief through monumental architecture and artistic detail, designed to honor both the ruler and the gods who watched over him. The walls of the chamber were decorated with scenes that celebrated royal authority. Artists portrayed the king standing before deities who embraced him, crowned him, or offered him symbols of power. The scenes were painted with vibrant colors that still glowed in the flickering torchlight. Gold leaf adorned certain figures, catching the movement of the flames and casting shimmering reflections across the room. The images emphasized that even in death, the king remained a central figure in the cosmic order. His authority extended beyond the earthly realm and into the divine. At the center of the chamber stood the sarcophagus. It rested upon a raised stone platform, carved to resemble a sacred mound rising from the primeval waters. The Egyptians believed that creation began from such a mound, so placing the sarcophagus upon it symbolized the king's rebirth. The sarcophagus itself was a masterpiece. Its surface was covered in sheets of gold or gilded material, shaped and polished by skilled artisans. Intricate carvings decorated the exterior. These carvings included protective spells, invocations to the gods, and symbols associated with eternity. The lid often bore the likeness of the king, carved with serene expression and adorned with royal regalia. The priests approached the sarcophagus with careful steps. They placed the coffin upon a wooden sled and slowly maneuvered it toward the platform. Their movements were synchronized, guided by chants that kept their actions steady and precise. The Egyptians believed that the final placement of the coffin required absolute accuracy. Any mistake could disrupt the flow of spiritual energy within the chamber. The priests positioned the coffin directly beside the sarcophagus and paused, allowing silence to settle into the space. The atmosphere grew heavy with anticipation, as the rituals that followed carried deep significance. One of the central rituals involved the recitation of spells from the coffin texts and the Book of the Dead. These spells ensured that the king would awaken in the afterlife with clarity and strength. They described the opening of pathways, the granting of divine speech, and the restoration of movement. The priests recited these texts with measured rhythm. Their voices echoed across the chamber, merging with the soft crackling of torches. The sound created a layered atmosphere that felt both solemn and powerful. The Egyptians believed that these spoken words shaped the spiritual environment surrounding the king, forming a protective shield around the sarcophagus. After the recitations, the priests prepared to transfer the king from the coffin into the sarcophagus. They lifted the lid, revealing an interior lined with polished stone or gold. The inside of the lid bore inscriptions representing the protection of Nut, the sky goddess. Her arms extended across the surface as though embracing the king. The priests lowered the coffin lid and carefully lifted the mummy, supporting its weight through coordinated effort. They placed the king gently into the sarcophagus, aligning the body with symbolic markers carved into the interior. This act represented the final transition from earthly preparation to divine containment. Once the king rested inside, the priests placed amulets along the body. These amulets included symbols of life, stability, power, and protection. The ankh represented eternal life. The jade pillar symbolized endurance. The was scepter embodied authority. Each amulet was positioned according to tradition, creating a network of spiritual forces designed to safeguard the king for eternity. The priests then spread perfumed oils across the body, believing that these substances strengthened the connection between the king and the divine realm. The fragrance filled the chamber with rich notes of myrrh, lotus, and cedar. The closing of the sarcophagus was a moment of profound ritual significance. The priests gathered in a circle around the platform and raised their torches. They recited a final invocation that asked the gods to seal the king's spirit in safety. When the invocation ended, they lowered the heavy lid onto the sarcophagus. The sound of the stone, or gilded surface settling into place, echoed through the chamber. It signaled the completion of the most sacred task within the burial process. The king had taken his rightful place within the heart of the tomb. Around the walls, niches contained statues of protective deities. These figures included Anubis, who watched over embalming, Selket, who guarded the canopic jars, and Thoth, who recorded the king's achievements. Their carved forms stood in eternal vigilance. The priests believed that once activated through ritual, the statues would remain alert throughout eternity, guarding the king against forces that sought to disrupt his eternal rest. The chamber thus became a sanctuary fortified by divine presence. The architecture of the chamber emphasized stability and eternity. Massive stone blocks shaped the walls, and the ceiling was carved in the form of the sky goddess stretching across the heavens. Her painted body created the impression that she held the entire chamber within her embrace. This symbolic design underscored the belief that the king re-entered the cosmic order through her. The chamber was not simply a burial room. It was a cosmic chamber where earth, sky, and divine protection converged. When the rituals ended, the priests lowered their torches and bowed. Their footsteps receded slowly as they prepared to move into the final corridor of the tomb. Behind them, the chamber of the golden sarcophagus remained illuminated by a faint, steady glow, as though the gold itself held light. The chamber stood as the culmination of everything the tomb represented. It was a place where mortality met eternity, and where the pharaoh began his everlasting reign among the gods. The final act of a pharaoh's burial was not simply the closing of a tomb. It was a ritual of cosmic significance, believed to shape the king's eternal destiny and preserve the harmony between the worlds of the living and the dead. After completing the sacred placement of the king within the chamber of the golden sarcophagus, the priests made their way into the last corridor of the tomb. This passage led to the outer entrance, and with each step, the atmosphere shifted from divine intimacy to solemn finality. The Egyptians viewed this final stage as the sealing of eternity, a moment when the mortal world surrendered the king to the gods. Every ritual and architectural detail emphasized the gravity of this transition. As the priests walked through the final corridor, they carried torches that flickered against walls painted with scenes of closure and protection. These scenes often depicted the goddess Ma'at restoring balance, the god Anubis sealing sacred doors, and the sun god Ra disappearing into the horizon before beginning his nightly journey. The images reminded the priests that they were participating in a cycle that had existed since the first kings of Egypt. The pharaoh's burial was never an isolated event. It was part of the ongoing rhythm that bound the kingdom to the divine. The priests moved with quiet purpose, aware that their actions carried weight far beyond the moment. One of the final rituals performed in the corridor involved the scattering of natron along the floor. Natron symbolized purity and preservation. The priests sprinkled it in slow arcs, ensuring that every step taken toward the entrance followed a path cleansed of spiritual impurities. This act symbolized the removal of earthly residue. The Egyptians believed that even the smallest trace of human imperfection could interfere with the king's journey. By cleansing the corridor, the priests created a sacred boundary between the deeper chambers and the world above. At the threshold leading out of the final corridor stood a symbolic doorway carved with protective spells. The priests paused before it and raised their hands in an invocation known as the gesture of the western horizon. This gesture acknowledged the realm where the sun set and where the souls of the blessed traveled. The doorway represented the last point at which human presence could influence the tomb. Beyond this point, only gods and spirits held authority. The priests whispered a quiet blessing, allowing the sound to fade naturally into the stillness. Once outside the innermost chambers, the priests moved to the entrance ramp, which led upward toward the surface. This passage was designed to echo the path between the underworld and the living world. As the priests ascended, the light of their torches grew brighter against the stone, as though symbolizing the final separation between earthly life and divine eternity. Their chants shifted to tones of closure, reflecting ancient texts that describe the sealing of sacred spaces. These chants asked the gods to guard the tomb forever and to prevent chaos from entering. At the entrance chamber, workers who had waited in silence now stepped forward. They were responsible for the physical sealing of the tomb. The priests handed them ceremonial tools, including chisels, mallets, and plaster bowls. These tools were symbolic as well as practical. They represented human effort working in service of divine purpose. The workers did not begin their task until the priests completed a final invocation that acknowledged the cooperation between humanity and the gods. This invocation described the joining of hands across worlds and asked for cosmic approval of the sealing process. When the invocation ended, the workers began closing the entrance. Massive stone blocks had been prepared in advance, carved to fit perfectly within the doorway. They slid these blocks into place with coordinated strength. The sound of stone meeting stone echoed deeply through the structure. Each block symbolized a layer of protection. The Egyptians believed that the sealing of the tomb created a fortress around the king, ensuring that his journey remained undisturbed. The workers applied plaster around the edges to merge the block seamlessly with the surrounding stone. When finished, even the outlines of the doorway disappeared. A final ritual completed the sealing. The priests approached the now hidden door and pressed their palms against the cool stone. They recited a passage known as the Seal of Eternity. This text invoked gods such as Anubis, Thoth, and Ma'at, asking them to protect the tomb against both physical and spiritual intrusion. The priests believed that once this seal was spoken, the doorway became spiritually locked. The presence of the gods guarded it with vigilance, ensuring that the tomb remained a space of purity and sanctity. After completing the seal, the priests extinguished their torches. Darkness filled the corridor behind the sealed door, symbolizing the withdrawal of human influence. The priests turned away and began the slow ascent toward the outer world. The sun, which had been high when the ceremony began, now stood lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the desert. The timing symbolized the completion of a cycle. The pharaoh had been delivered into the realm where night and eternity intertwined. Once the priests emerged from the tomb, they performed a final act. They poured a small offering of water onto the ground. This gesture represented the continuation of life. It acknowledged that although the king had entered eternity, the Nile would continue to flow, the crops would continue to grow, and the kingdom he ruled would carry on. The priests bowed toward the sealed entrance and began their journey back to the temple where further rites of remembrance would be performed. The tomb, now sealed, became a silent world preserved beneath layers of stone and sand. Within its chambers, the pharaoh rested inside the golden sarcophagus, surrounded by guardians, offerings, sacred maps, and vessels that carried his identity. The Egyptians believed that from this silent sanctuary, the king would rise each night to join the sun god, travel through the underworld, and emerge renewed with dawn. The sealing of eternity ensured that this cosmic cycle remained unbroken, marking the completion of one of the most profound rituals in human history.